the what, why, and how of exposure compensation. Now, exposure compensation is a powerful tool that will allow you to fine-tune the exposure of your photos. And understanding how to use exposure compensation effectively will help you achieve perfect exposure in your images every time, especially in challenging lighting situations. Now, before we do dive in, make sure that you've head over to my website. It is on3legs.com, and if you put the /10 tips, so that's on3legs with the number 3.com /10 tips with the number 10, you can download your free copy of my ebook. Now, it's called 10 Tips to Better Photos, and what it does is it has 10 tips in there, plus a bonus tip, a little spoiler alert there, that will help you take creative control over your camera. All right, so what is exposure compensation? Well, exposure compensation is a camera setting that lets you adjust the exposure level chosen by your camera's brain or automatic settings, such as things like aperture priority, shutter priority, or even if you're shooting full auto. It's measured in stops, and it typically ranges from -3 to +3, and it's measured in 1/3 stop increments. Now, don't worry about what a stop is for now. We'll just see how to use exposure compensation. If you're not sure what a stop is, stick with me. I'll help you understand how to use this setting because it's really important to get the right exposure. Now, when it comes to exposure compensation, positive values make your image brighter and negative values will make your image darker. So you just got to think about when you would use exposure compensation. Now, most modern cameras today are pretty good at determining, I told you I can't speak today, at determining the correct exposure. They can sometimes be fooled by, tricky lighting situations. For example, in a backlit scene where your subject is in front of a bright background, so let's say you're shooting a person with the sunset behind them, your camera might underexpose the person. And that's pretty common, right? Because it's trying to make the exposure right for all the light behind that person. In high contrast scenes with both very bright and very dark areas, the camera might find it might struggle to really find a balanced exposure. Something in snow or maybe sand scenes, these can often appear too dark because the camera compensates for all the brightness because of all the the light being reflected all over the place. And also in situations where your metering mode might not be set to the best setting for the lighting conditions that you might end up with shooting in, you might end up with something brighter or something darker than you expected. And that's pretty common. I see this happen to a lot of photographers as they learn how to use their cameras. So exposure compensation is your ticket to getting your exposure right. And in all my years of running photography workshop, this is the one setting that many don't know how to use. And today we're going to run through exactly how to use it. Okay. So first of all, I think the thing is to locate how you adjust exposure compensation. On most cameras, the exposure compensation button is marked with a +/- symbol, or it could be a dial on top with settings from sort of -3 on the left to the right, might be +3. You might have to check your camera's manual if you're unsure where to find it, because of course every camera is slightly different, but that's typically what you're looking for. What I want you to do is just grab that setting and adjust the setting. Learn how to use the exposure compensation dial or the menu setting to adjust the exposure. And you can turn it up into the positive values to brighten an image, or you can turn it down into the negative values to darken your images. And then what you do is you sort of review and adjust as you go. And you'll take a shot, review it on your camera's LCD screen, adjust the exposure compensation as needed until you achieve the desired exposure or brightness that you're wanting out of your image. Just a word of warning, your camera screen has its own brightness settings for the preview screen. It might give you a bit of a false impression of how bright or dark your image actually is. And the only true way to check your exposure is to look at the histogram on your camera. Now, if you're not sure what tools to use on your camera to check exposure, I do have a course on my website. It's like I call it a mini but mighty course called Nailing Exposure. And you can go and check that out if you want. Once again, on 3legs with the number 3.com. Just click on the training tab and you'll find it there. But it's called Nailing Exposure, and it's about helping you get the perfect exposure every time. Now, as with all my videos, in this one, I want to make sure I give you some practical tips so you'll learn exactly how to use your exposure compensation. So grab your camera and let's take some images. Now, for bright backgrounds, we're going to need to increase exposure compensation when photographing a subject against a bright background. Like if you're outside and you've got a bright sky, or maybe in the snow, and you want to you want to avoid underexposing your subject, then you will you've got to make some exposure compensation settings for that. So you've got to bump it up a bit if you want the subject to be brighter, and that's going to be a little bit counterintuitive because it's going to look bright all around your subject. Now, what's likely to happen is you're going to expose the background, overexpose the background when doing this. For darker backgrounds, you can decrease the exposure compensation when your subject is against a dark background, and this will prevent overexposure, because let's say you've got a person's in a dark situation where you're trying to take their photo, it might end up overexposing because it's trying to compensate for all the darkness in the frame. Once again, in this situation, you are likely to underexpose the background. Okay, so overexpose it if you're going to bump it up, underexpose it, but you'll get the subject right. And that's really, if that's what you're trying to photograph, that'll really work well. Now, both of those aren't ideal because you're going to have overexposed and underexposed. So my suggestion is you want to experiment with a bunch of small adjustments to find a balance that preserves the detail in both the bright areas and the dark areas of your image. These are called highlights and shadows. So bright's known as highlights, and the dark is known as shadows. And so if you can find a bit of a balance, then you can adjust these in post-processing. And I always err on the side of safety, and your image should be a bit darker than you would like because it's easier to increase the shadows than it is to decrease the highlights when it comes to post-processing. Now, to actually practice this, I suggest you grab your camera and find a subject to shoot. You want to change your exposure compensation to -3 and take a shot, and then gradually increase your exposure compensation by one whole stop. That's a whole number, okay, every shot that you take. So you do -3, -2, -1, and then 0, and so on. So, and take a shot of the exact same subject for each setting until you get to +3. Then you can review all of the 7 images, because that's how many you'll have, from -3 through to +3, and you can see the different exposure, the difference that exposure compensation makes to your final image. And if you're unsure of the correct exposure, you can use a technique called exposure bracketing. And this is where you take those multiple shots at different exposure levels, just as you did in that previous exercise. And this does give you then many images to pick from, right? So then you can just pick the one that is the most correctly exposed image, or the one that's exposed the way that you want. And if you have to, you've now got enough exposures that you can blend several of them together for HDR, okay, which a lot of software does, and you can get dedicated software for. As I mentioned earlier, really you need to use your camera's histogram to check exposure, because a well-balanced histogram can help you decide if you need to adjust the exposure compensation. We're not going to go into histograms today. I'll do that in another video in the future. But that is the only way to really, truly tell if your image is exposed properly. All right. Well, I hope you found these tips on exposure compensation helpful. If you are enjoying these Focus Friday tips, then let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. Of course, if you do go across to my website and download any of the freebies there, you will end up on my Focus Friday email. It's a different tip coming out each week in an email, and that'll just help you get creative control over your camera. All right, that's all there is left for you for today. All that's left for you to do now is for you to get out there and take some photos. See ya.